Hi, folks. This is Eiko Fried. I'm happy to record my presentation today on using network theories and models to understand, predict, treat, and explain perhaps mental health problems. Thanks for the invitation. Hope the recording will work out okay. And let's start with network theory. So I will make the clear distinction today between theories and methods. And I think the term model has been quite harmful in this area because folks have confused theoretical models with statistical models. And I hope some clarity will help here. And I'll try to introduce this by separating theories from models a little more. So we'll be talking about systems and networks today. And one of the most pertinent questions here is why features co-occur in nature. If we think about measles or other infectious diseases, for example, features like symptoms of measles co-occur in nature because they have a common cause. So on the left side here, you see in the center a common cause, the infection itself. And then in the outer ring, you see symptoms caused by the infection, a rash, fever, the Koplik spots on the person's tongue. And we can use these symptoms to indicate the presence of an underlying disease that we cannot often observe directly, right? It's a latent disease, but a good doctor will be able to infer the presence of this latent disease. So one explanation for why symptoms co-occur in nature is a common cause. Recent work in psychology, but also in ecology and in other sciences has shown that some features co-occur in nature, not because of a common cause, but because they are part of a system where elements cause each other. There's been work on personality, intelligence, comorbidity, but in particular, symptoms of mental disorders, such as depression. And the idea would here then be that not a latent common cause gives rise to insomnia and fatigue, but that insomnia causes fatigue, which explains the correlation between these two variables in our data sets. So symptoms are correlated because of mutual causal dependent structures. Going back to the common cause theory, if we focus on symptoms and mental health problems, symptoms would be passive interchangeable indicators. Doesn't really particularly matter what kind of symptom a person has, which goes back to how the DSM categorizes symptoms. Often you need to have 5 out of 9 or 4 out of 7. The nature doesn't really matter. They're roughly interchangeable. A symptom is an indicator of an underlying disease, and the intervention should then focus on the common cause, right? In the same way that we treat measles with antibiotics, for example, rather than treating the dots on a person's tongue, well, they wouldn't do anything under this causal model. I think of a good example of the common cause model using the kraken under the water here. We can all see the indicators, the symptoms. We cannot see the body of the kraken, but we can all infer its presence to be there. And that's how psychometrics works. This is I couldn't get this animated here in the recording. This is a panda bear in the animated video. You see a panda bear and he's holding onto the ball, and there's a hand coming in from the side trying to take the ball, and the panda bear is holding onto its ball. And that's what I see the role of network psychometricians to be in the last decade. I myself. So the ball here is the common cause theory for mental disorders. The panda bear is psychiatry or maybe clinical psychology. And then the hand trying to take the ball is sort of us network psychometricians trying to propose alternative theories, trying to suggest that common cause theories might not be feasible for mental health problems, at least for some of them, depression, anxiety, and so on. But I'm not sure if it was so successful. Network theoretical accounts, on the other hand, propose that symptoms are important autonomous causal agents. So you want to study insomnia, and you want to study sad mood, and you want to study suicidal ideation in depression, because they all are important causal agents from this perspective. The intervention could then focus on symptoms, for example. Deactivating one symptom may deactivate subsequent symptoms in the system. And then the mental disorder I'm going to talk about emergence later can be thought of as a property that comes out of these relations among symptoms. So that was the first kind of half decade of network psychometrics, starting 2010, 2012, 14, 15, with important work by a group in Amsterdam, and also others, of course. Günter Schiepeck, Adele Hayes have talked about this for much longer. And then more recently, we've seen, I think, a shift away from these symptoms. Symptoms played an important role early on in this field because in the latent variable literature, in the common cause literature, in the DSM and the ICD, folks have primarily focused on symptoms. But I think if you take a network perspective seriously, if you take a systems approach to mental health, all of a sudden you really want to include other factors like stressful life events and other experiences, environmental stressors, social factors that constrain you, homelessness, right, constrains you in a mental health space sometimes, and so forth. So we've also seen a move away from symptoms, which I think is very important. And I'll talk about this later a little bit. Okay, now we go from this very simple idea that there are only symptoms, and there's the common cause idea that causes symptoms, or the mutual symptom idea, this systems idea. We want to move on a little bit further and really talk about complex systems, not just systems. And here, to talk about complex systems, I need to talk about reductionism quickly. Reductionism is the idea that you can understand the properties of a system by understanding the components of a system. And so I'll tell you a little story. This is a true story. I am a big fan of Ken Kendler. Many of you might know Ken Kendler. He's a psychiatrist, geneticist, philosopher, very humble, spectacularly prolific, very thoughtful scholar. I've long been a very big fan of Ken Kendler. And to the degree that I sometimes feel like when I talk to Ken on Zoom or Skype, I need to sort of take down my metaphorical Ken Kendler posters on the back of my wall. They aren't really there, but I really feel like a very, very big fan of Ken Kendler. And so Ken invited me to come to Virginia 2019 and to work with him for a few months. I was very humbled and I was very nervous to work with him. And he gave me his bicycle. Ken is an avid cyclist, and on the left side you see this is a photograph of the dorm I stayed in for a couple of months. This is Ken's secondary bicycle, an extremely expensive vintage bicycle, from my understanding. And you see where this story is going. Ken gave me his bicycle. I was terrified to, break it, and I actually broke Ken Kendler's bicycle after a few days of being in Virginia, accidentally. Now, reductionism turned out, I've always criticized reductionism and so forth and reductionist approaches, but I found out that day that reductionism is an amazingly powerful framework to operate under in science. Because under a reductionist perspective, if something that we're studying is a simple system, such as a bicycle, a simple mechanical system where the pedal moves the cogwheel, which moves the chain, which moves another cogwheel, which moves the bicycle wheel. In simple systems like this, where elements are not interdependent, they can cause each other, but properties of the wheel don't change as a function of properties of the cog or properties of the pedal. In systems like this, I can decompose my system to all its constituent elements. I can fix or understand all individual elements, and I can put it back together again. And that's exactly what I could do with the bicycle of Ken Kendler. I could repair the bicycle because it is a simple mechanical system and because reductionism works really, really well in these systems. That's what helped us humans understand a lot about how nature works, how the universe works. However, if we've learned anything in the last half century in complexity science and system science, is that reductionism works not very well in complex systems. So this is a lake here. I couldn't find a photograph of a Dutch lake. I think this is in Canada, but let's pretend this is a Dutch lake. Many of you know that the Dutch have plenty of lakes here. And in ecology, scholars have worked for decades figuring out why some lakes here turn from these blue, beautiful states of lakeness into these turbid green, smelly, ugly, gross, diseased lake states. Right, so we have the healthy lake and sort of the diseased lake. They can tip from one attractor state to the other attractor state. And ecologists studies this for decades. And only once they started studying the systems which give rise to the lake state, rather than just the individual components, as you would do in a simple mechanical system, such as a bicycle, did they start understanding how to forecast transitions into depression. It's been a long day. I'm going to get there soon. How to forecast transitions into diseased lake states, but also how to intervene on diseased lake states to move them back to their original attractor state. In this case, for example, you want to fish out all the fish, which can help the lake transition back. Counterintuitive, but it works. Okay. And I wrote a recent paper called Studying Systems, Not Syndromes. But this was my preferred title. Mental health problems are like lakes, not like bicycles. But I think the editor wasn't a big fan of this. In any case, I think mental health problems are more like lakes. I think they are emergent states that arise out of the interactions of many components that are more than symptoms, of course. These systems, these mental health systems, they have biopsychosocial components. They have causal relations between those that are really tricky to map out, of course, nonlinear and complex and dynamic over time. But the main message is that to better understand mental health problems, we therefore need to start studying the systems from which these mental health problems emerge. So that's sort of the core assumptions I'm operating under. And that needed to be the start for the presentation today. So now we need to get into the weeds of what a complex system is, and I really can't do this in a short presentation on something that is only peripherally related. So I'm only going to say a few cornerstones of what makes a complex system. A complex system can behave non-intuitively. It is complex after all. So it can be really tricky to forecast, even if I know how the system was at state 1, 2, and 3 in time. It can be really tricky to forecast how it will be at the 4th time point. Complex systems can feature radically disproportionate causation. That means a small intervention doesn't necessarily have to have small effects. You can have small interventions that lead to cascades, and you have, a catastrophic shift in the system. Elements are interdependent. I'm going to talk about this in the next slides, what this is. And you can have emergence, and I'm also going to talk about this now. So this is a video that doesn't really run properly here, but you've all seen a flock of birds. You can imagine how this looks like. The birds move together over time. And this goes back to my first question. I said, why do components or features in the universe co-occur? Here, if you think about a three-dimensional matrix of data, right, these birds co-occur over time. They flow together through time in a pattern. And again, we can talk about the common cause theory, which many people believe to be true for a long time. There is one bird that tells all the other birds where to go, for example, was a very common idea also for a swarm of fish, that there's sort of a general bird. We had common cause thoughts, but that's not true. We know today that the network perspective is the explanation here, where birds interact with each other in a causal system, and that sort of gives this pattern. But the main point is, you can study individual birds, elements of our systems, all you want. You will never discover flocking, because flocking happens at the level of where things come together, at the level of the macro system, not at the level of the micro elements of the system. Right? That's what emergence is. And you have that also for other things. For H2O, for example, you can study hydrogen and oxygen all you want. You will never discover fluidity. Fluidity is an emergent property that arises when these things interact with each other. And for interdependence, it means that one property depends on the other. And you have this in predator and prey relationships, for example. It's very hard to understand if you get more or less predators over time without understanding if you have more or less prey over time. These systems are interdependent. The more predators, the fewer prey, right? Because they eat them. But when you have too few prey, predators starve because they have nothing to eat, and then the prey population recovers. One of the coolest aspects of emergent properties is that they can have independent causal status. And I love that example from the Sandra Mitchell's book, Unsimple Truths. Bees fly around, collect honey. They store it in a beehive. And when the beehive is full, which is an emergent property, right? The bees are not even aware. It's not like they chat with each other and then sort of determine, oh, our beehive is 70% full. This is a system. And the beehive and the honey hive is a emergent property. And once the honey storage is full, it exerts causal influence on the bees that then stop collecting honey, which is sort of, if you think about that, quite crazy. Okay, so usually at this point, I talk about statistics, but I thought it would be much more interesting to show you guys why the systems perspective on mental health problems may offer utility, both academically and clinically. And when we talk about utility, we need to talk about 4 aspects of utility. In science, at least I want to describe better. I want to predict better. I want to control better. In clinical psychology, that's prevention or treatment. And I want to explain, I want to understand better. And so I'm going to now talk through 4 aspects of utility: description, prediction, control, explanation, and go a bit more into details about the network models that we might use to do that and how this could be useful. The first one is description, and I want to hear, so where the goal would be to statistically estimate and visualize systems with tools from systems and network sciences to get a basic understanding of how this all works. It's appropriate to say thanks to all the other disciplines that have invented network science and use them, and we use tools from these disciplines. And it's also important that this is more like Newtonian physics, not so much Einsteinian physics. So we have quite simple, so as in the sense of Newton's model of gravity, theory of gravity, they turn out to be incorrect, but it turned out to do pretty well for the bounds of our solar system to predict and so forth. And so the same is the case here. The models we use are all simple pairwise linear models, and they are probably not sort of properly mapping out the real complexities of all the complex systems that I'm talking about right now. And that's perhaps okay for a first step of description, right? In the best case, we want to use more fancy methods, but it's the first step in this agenda, description. I'm not a natural born coder. I don't have a strong math background, but I have coded a lot in R, and I've written quite a few tutorial papers with some colleagues. And on my website, you can find code for all my papers following 2015. So there's lots of papers with lots of code on network models out there. And my code is maybe a little clunky, but it is pretty clean. And so if you want to learn how this stuff works in R, my website is a decent starting point. There are also many other amazing resources out there, of course. Yeah. Okay, looking at the time. Great. We have 3 types of data, and then that means we can fit 3 types of models in psychology, broadly speaking. First data set is cross-sectional. We have a large sample size, 1 time point, and then we can fit a number of network models to this. I'm going to talk about one particular model today, the Gaussian graphical model. This is a fancy term for partial correlation network. I'm going to go back and I'm going to explain to you now briefly in 30 seconds why we use partial correlation networks. So this is node A. I need to see, can you see this here? Okay, this is node A, node B, and node C. So A causes B in the middle, and B causes C. A fully causes B. B is caused by nothing else but A, and B fully causes C. Right? So A arrow B, B arrow C. If you estimate this, if you simulate data from that, and you estimate 0 order correlations, you just look at the correlations among those, A and C will have a correlation between them, although they're causally independent. If you estimate partial correlations, A and C will be independent from each other given B, right? Because that's how the system works. That doesn't mean partial correlations give you prioritized insight into the nature of causality, But it is true that partial correlations can be more useful for mapping out causal skeletons. This is a 30-second primer. There's a lot more to this, but that's all I can do in this short time. That is why this field isn't particularly interested in conditional independence models or partial correlation models. The Gaussian graphical model family is one of those. So you have nine variables in this data set. These happen to be domains of schizotypic personality or personality disorder, if you want. This is a very large data set of 25,000 people who got a questionnaire on this. And the network model will estimate partial correlations between all of these variables in your data set. And what we can see here, for example, is that folks who indicate that they have no close friends are the same folks that are very likely to have constricted affect. So there's a positive blue edge between these two variables, and that indicates a strong partial correlation. Not going to go into the weeds of the model here. That's all I think that's important. There's also negative edges in this model, such as that folks with indicating high social anxiety are less likely to be folks who have odd or magical beliefs. So negative partial correlation between two variables, easy to interpret. I'm not going to go into the clinical interpretation here. I'm just trying to explain the models to you. The second type of data that I'm really interested in and work with most these days is time series data. So you have many time points in the data sets we want for these models here. You really want like 50, 100, 300 time points to do this. We often collect data using smart watches. So I ask people on my smartphone, sorry, not smartwatch, smartphone. I ask people using an app 3, 4, 5 times a day, a couple of questions. I do this for a couple of weeks, and all of a sudden I have a few hundred measurement points. I have some variables, not too many, because things get very tricky to estimate otherwise. And I can do this in one person, idiographic. This is the, small is beautiful, or I can do this in a larger group of people as well. And then I can use different models. And so this is I'm going to talk about vector autoregressive models today. And again, they follow this principle of partial correlations that I talked about before. So I get two networks out of this. But sort of simplified two. This is a COVID data set we collected during the early days of COVID in students about stress. And so what you can see here is that on the left side in the contemporaneous network, you have undirected edges. There are no arrows because the network is, so to speak, cross-sectional. And that means here on the left side, when people indicate that they worry at a given time point, then at the same time point, they are more likely to indicate that they are nervous. So contemporaneous. So within the same beep, if you will, of the smartphone assessment. Again, not going to go into the clinical implications and or whatnot. You also see here, so future is a negative node. Future means I'm worried about my future. And you can see in the temporal network that people who worry about their future are more likely to feature anhedonia or report anhedonia at the next measurement point, and vice versa. So these are usually lag 1 models, meaning we predict the next measurement moment or the next beep. In our case, these were 4 or 5 hours in between here. Yeah, so these are temporal networks. I'm going to give you a couple more examples. This is from a paper by Sasha Epscombe about the Gaussian graphical model. Sorry, I was teaching 4 hours today and I talked too much today already. And here you have 2 individual patients and you fit network models here, both temporal networks and contemporaneous networks in 2 patients. Not going to talk about the clinical things in detail, but you do see that these network structures differ across these 2 patients quite considerably, even though we're featuring the same edges. For the lower patient, for example, you see a vicious cycle between bodily discomfort and rumination. This is not the case for the other person. And for the lower person, you also see, for example, a relation between bodily discomfort and rumination on the contemporaneous level. Now, of course, there's measurement error. There could be we're missing nodes here, perhaps. So don't take these networks literally, but they can be a nice starting point for discussions among patients and clinicians, I think. Here on the left side, this is a different network. I wanted to highlight that there are situations where the contemporaneous and the temporal network can give you different or similar information. So here we see in both networks relations between frustrated and angry, both contemporaneously and temporally, and they're both positive. Makes some sense. But interestingly, and it also makes sense, on the right side, you see that when people are energetic, at the same time, they're more likely to exercise. Makes sense. If I feel really energetic, I might be at the gym. I might go to the gym. But on the left side, in the temporal lag 1 network, now we're talking about a couple hours, if people are more energetic, if people are more exercising at a given time point, they're less likely to feel energetic at the next measurement moment, which also makes sense, right? But the opposite is true here too. If people are more energetic, they're more likely to exercise, which makes sense. So contemporaneous and temporal can give you different sources of information or constructs where that is sensible or feasible. Lastly, we have panel data. I'm not going to talk about these in detail today. These are your epidemiological data where you have, 5 measurement points once per year. You can also fit network models to that. All right. This is a data set. This is a tutorial paper of Danny Borsboom and colleagues that has everything I just talked about before, including the data sets, which are open, including the code, which is open. So this is a good starting point to model these things. So this was the first part of utility, right? Description. And now I'm going to talk about the second part of utility of these systems approaches for prediction. This is my favorite part. And now I hope, okay. So now you need to, I know that some of you will be listening to this like a podcast. Now you need to return to the screen. Oh, maybe this doesn't work. Okay, I need to hold it in front of my head, otherwise it's taken out by the camera. So this is a playing card. I hope you can see it, okay? And now this playing card can have only 2 stable states because I push it. It can be in this stable state in which it is now, or it can be in this stable state, right? I can only push it. Oops, that's not supposed to happen. I just found a 3rd stable state, but technically there are only 2 stable states in the system. It can only be here or here. And now, so this is a healthy state. This is me in a healthy state. And now I can make the system more resilient by pushing harder on the card. Now the state is more resilient, and it might even be in a state where the perturbation to get it to the other state has to be massive, okay? Now my system is in a more vulnerable state, and I can push it much more easily to the alternative stable state. So this is the metaphor we're operating under. And you can now measure in your vulnerable versus your resilient system how long it takes for your card, for your system, to recover from perturbation. So a perturbation would be somebody steps on my toes in the metro. That's a very small perturbation. Getting a divorce is a very big perturbation, right? All of us have those every day. You don't sleep very well once, and then the longer it takes for your system to recover from a perturbation provides information about the resilience of the state you're in. So the idea here. And when it takes longer for you to recover, you're more likely to be in a vulnerable state. And this can be a marker for increased likelihood to transition into mental health problems. I'm going to skip this here. So this is a paper of Marike Wichers and colleagues from one particular person. And you can see here over time, left to right, that this person relapses into depression at day 136 or so. The y-axis is depression severity. And you couldn't really forecast this, right? We're talking about prediction now. You couldn't really forecast this from measuring symptoms. When I talk to journalists about what we're doing right now, I always say you wouldn't try to forecast hurricanes by measuring wind, because probably if there's increasing wind, you're probably a little late to forecast your hurricane to do something about it. So instead, in system sciences, we use early warning signals, such as loss of resilience that I showed you before. So what we measure here is basically something like, hey, this system gets less and less resilient over time. I am in danger for a transition, right? So this sort of the card pressure changes. And there's evidence that you can pick this up by looking at system information. I'm not going to go into the statistics here, such as autocorrelations. And in this paper, they do find actually that in a particular early warning system, signal increases here, loss of resilience, that might anticipate or predict this transition into depression here. In my own work, in the warranty study, we're doing just this right now in 2,000 people. So we follow 2,000 people for 2 years. We have a large baseline battery about depression risk factors. Then we do 3 months of EMA, so ecological momentary assessment and smartwatch assessment, and measure people's systems. We try to map out their context and environmental stressors, their biopsychosocial field. And then we follow them for 2 more years, every 3 months online to see if they transition into depression. And then we're trying to find out whether the system level data can provide utility in anticipating these transitions, forecasting them, and perhaps developing some sort of intervention or prevention for that. It's just an example. This is a very simplified example. We're just starting to look at the data right now, where this person, in the top, you can see this person sort of decreasing in positive mood. At the same time, the person reports being more tired, and there's also an increase in negative mood. So this could be a very simple example of something that you might want to forecast. But again, we have much more data. This is just a very, very quick look at the data. And if anybody's interested, we have a protocol paper online about the study. And there's also a 4-minute YouTube video that I think is really cute, that worked out pretty well, where we describe the study in some detail. Yeah. Okay, third aspect of utility. What else can we do with the systems perspective? I think it can provide us new levers for controlling systems. Ultimately, that's what I would like to do in warranty, right? I would like to prevent, which is control. This is a paper by T. Henry and colleagues, where we estimated networks, not based on the models I showed you before, but based on very similar statistical models. And these are networks of people, idiographic networks of individuals who were in treatment in the US for complicated grief, bereavement. They've lost somebody perhaps years ago, and they're still doing very badly. And so in therapy, people follow them over time. And now what we do is a simulation study. That is, we take the network that people had before they entered treatment, and we make the networks longer. So we simulate 1,000 measurement points and just pretend this network structure would last forever. And now we use a tool from statistical physics and engineering called control theory. And with control theory, you're basically simulating interventions on the system, and you can determine what you want to do. You want to push on this node, for example. So I try to treat this particular symptom, or I try to break an edge between 2 symptoms, or I try to push all symptoms down at the same time. And you can then study how effective these interventions are on the system for your goal of, for example, reducing all the symptoms or reducing one symptom. And so this resulted in a nice statistical package. In R, this is how this could look like. For example, here in the first study, we intervene on suicidal ideation. Now, the clinicians in the audience might say, Aiko, this is very hard to do. I agree. Just an example. And on the top figure, you see the intervention strength. So basically, that would be sort of the psychotherapy points or effort you need to invest in reducing this node. And you can see you need to do a lot of work early on, but then you sort of need to only maintain a few times, or you can think of it as the number of medications people need to use. And in the lower graph, you see what symptoms in the network go down. And in particular, of course, the dark blue symptom, suicidalization, goes down. And the second symptom, thoughts of loved one, also goes down, the other blue one here, mainly because suicidal ideation has an outgoing edge on thoughts of the loved one. So obviously, if you intervene on one, the other will go down as well. In the paper, we also do other interventions. So here we do a main intervention on one symptom and then other interventions that are very weak on the other symptoms, and we see what happens and so forth and so forth. I think it's a really useful tool. Is it ready to use in your clinic? I don't think so. But I think I'm just trying to show you utility of a systems perspective. I think this is a fantastic way to think about new treatment targets and so forth. Lastly, let me look at the time. I think I have 10 more minutes, so that's going to be okay. I think systems perspectives have immense utility for explanation, because I think the world is structured as a system. I think mental health problems are systems or are embedded in systems. And so mapping that out is really tricky. What are all the things that go into the system? Yeah, that's hard to answer. if you go beyond symptoms, like what should be out, I don't know, personality, healthcare systems, political systems, very quickly you have a very big system of 1,000 of variables that will not be useful anymore. So it's a real question. But I think trying to work on this will help us understand things a little better. And one example is the beer shortage in Germany and the water shortage in Italy. So last year, there was big talk in Germany about lack of beer production capacity. And in Italy, there was an actual shortage of sparkling water for a couple of months in July, August, September. Some of you might have seen this in the news. The reason is that the Ukraine war increased gas prices, electricity prices. Germany and Italy produce fertilizer, ammonia, a lot of it, which is extremely energy intensive. And the producers of ammonia said it's not worth, the gas prices are so expensive, we will stop producing ammonia because we lose money on it. Might as well not do it. Now, ammonia produces CO2 as a byproduct, which is sold by the companies to beer and water producers, water for sparkling water and beer. I think you need to flush the barrels. They do that with CO2. I don't know enough about it, why, but that led to a shortage of CO2, and that led to a production problem with beers and water. So I'm using this example. This is not a complex system, of course, but of course, from a systems perspective, none of these steps is counterintuitive. They all make sense. It's just that nobody mapped this out properly to anticipate that increases in gas prices in the Ukraine would lead to a sparkling water shortage. But it could have been done. There's no rocket science here. So systems perspective provides utility. And the last example I'm going to do, which is probably the hardest, is I'm going to show you a network theory. So explanation means theory, building, and testing. I'm going to show you a network theory for a mental disorder. Namely, Don Robino wrote a paper that I highly recommend on a formal theory or a computational theory where you write down all your thoughts as equations for panic disorder and panic attacks. What does this, and we did this on panic disorder and panic attacks because there's quite a bit of agreement how these work compared to, for example, depression or OCD, where many experts still disagree about the etiology and the symptoms and the treatment and so forth, right? So panic disorder in that sense is quite an easy target to start with a formal theory, a formal network theory. So we started out describing phenomena that a good theory needs to be able to explain, right? And these include, for panic disorder, panic attacks, the phenomenology that is quite specific, right? We all know what a panic attack looks like, that some people are more vulnerable to developing panic attacks and panic disorder, the onset of panic disorder, that they're non-clinical panic attacks, right? Some folks get panic attacks. Ken Kendler always says they're truck drivers in the US and sort of they white knuckle through it on the wheel, like you get these white knuckles and they don't get panic disorder. They just get a couple panic attacks. And we know that cognitive behavioral therapy works quite well for panic disorder, right? So these are 5 phenomena. There's more, but we agreed on these 5 on the outset. And now if you look into the literature, many of these theories have some sort of vicious cycle in the center between perceived threat and then physical arousal or bodily sensations, right? All of you work on anxiety disorders will know this. And so in the center here, you have arousal and perceived threat, and you have these sort of arrows going both ways. So this is our computational model, and this is a vicious cycle. And then for arousal, you can see this little circle here that is a negative homeostatic feedback loop that simply means arousal will go down over time. Nobody has panic attacks for 10 years. Uninterrupted, I mean. Panic attacks stop. Your body shuts down after 10, 20, 30 minutes. That's all this says. And then there's all the other things. I'm not going to go into detail. The gray box here is fast moving. Everything outside is slower moving. So your arousal schema that moderates the relationship between arousal and perceived threat. For me, I have an arousal schema in the way that my arousal does not tell me that there's perceived threat. But other people have an arousal schema that makes them believe that physical arousal amounts to perceived threat, right? So that's the moderation here. You can engage in escape behavior, and then you learn certain things and you avoid and so forth. And we wrote all of this down in difference equations. This is how the final model looks like. And all of these, this is a network model. except that we don't estimate it on data. We wrote down how we think the true processes work out using mathematics, using difference equations in this case, and now we can simulate data from it. For one person, we can say, okay, for person one, arousal schema is this value, and so they're very likely to perceive arousal as threat, and we can simulate data from it. We can see if they get panic attacks. We can then use CBT treatment, right? We can see where would treatment work on. We use control theory to reduce this node. And this shows, from in my perspective, the immense utility of network perspectives for understanding mental health disorders, for trying to explain them. I will actually skip this part here and briefly touch on a few limitations and challenges in the literature. There's a lot. I've written a couple papers on this, so have many other people. This is a new field. Please be kind and gentle with us, right? We're trying to figure this out. But yeah, embracing the complexity of mental health problems will remain difficult for the foreseeable future. Obviously, people are really different from each other. There are many factors that play a role. I wanted to highlight a couple of things. First, and I think this is a problem sometimes, and sometimes also I think it's not a problem. So I'll leave it up to you to think about this. There's a mismatch between the theoretical complexity and statistical simplicity. Sometimes I think it's fine to approximate complex stuff using simple methods. But in this literature in particular, for example, we think that network theory would say that mental health problems are maintained by vicious cycles, right? You have feedback loops between different processes. This is a figure by Jonas Hasselbeck and colleagues. And on the left side, you have three particular statistical models, the VAR model, the Gaussian graphical model, and the Ising model. And you can see that all three models do pretty well if you simulate data with feedback loops. All of them can recover these feedback loops pretty okay-ishly. That's good. That means these models sort of can corroborate or also reject our theories, right? Because these models in principle are able to detect feedback loops. And that means if there are no feedback loops in our data, that would speak against our theories. However, the idea of asymmetric relationships, for example, cannot be tested well using two of these three models. Different timescales are a problem. Higher order interactions, which is a strong assumption of some complex systems, cannot be verified, and so forth and so forth. So this is important to think about. One more example that's not in the paper, I think. In my field, many people use directed acyclic graphs, DAGs, for cross-sectional data. DAGs cannot estimate vicious cycles because I'm not going to go into detail here. So if your theory is there are vicious cycles that generate your data and you use a statistical model that cannot recover them, I'm not sure I'm not sure you can use your model to bring your data to bear on your theories. So that's worth thinking about, I think. I'm going to skip this. Time is very important here. You see a time series here with 3 measurement points in blue and 3 measurement points in red, and they're quite close to each other, but you would get a very different idea about the evolving of the process over time. In one, it goes down, the other goes up. It's a bit arbitrary. This example is very extreme, but it is important, of course, to think about the time frame of the dynamics of the systems we study. And there's no trivial answers here, of course. Many of us who do these studies we're obsessing deep at night over, like, should I have 4 measurement points per day or 8, or, how many measurement points can I do before people throw the phone against the wall? And do I reduce compliance and all of these issues? And what is the true nature of the processes? It's not an easy question. And then, of course, we have the garbage in, garbage out problem. So I'm going to call out my own work here. This is from a paper with these 24,000 participants. This is a questionnaire for schizotypal personality traits. And some folks asked me to estimate a network. I didn't really look into the content very much. And so I found a strong edge in the network. And only when I was done with the work, I looked it up. And node 18 is, do you often feel that other people have it in for you? And node 59 is, I often feel others have it in for me. Yeah. So this edge, of course, doesn't lend itself very well to mapping a causal skeleton because it's just literally the same question twice, which is why in the end we aggregated all these questions from this one component. And you saw that network before that only has 9 or 7 different components. But yeah, what does belong into a system and what doesn't? It's a real challenge. Going to end this with a brief joke. Kevin, I found this calculator in your room. Have you been doing math again? And the person says, sweating, no, I used that to smoke drugs as an excuse. So the joke here is network psychometrics requires statistical skills. Many of us work in clinical psychology. I have a PhD in that area, right? So learning R was really hard for me. I still struggle regularly with equations and papers that I can't easily read. So one solution here is to, focus a bit more on that. And the other is to collaborate more, right? We have fantastic biostatisticians. We have ecologists to do this sort of systems work. People in econometrics do this sort of work. And so maybe we can just draw in this expertise a little more to help us in the clinic, perhaps even to think about these things. Okay, thank you. Oh, this is also animated. There's this person is making a little heart that sort of floats up. I'd like to thank Ken and Dan and Don and of course Danny Borsboom also, who's not on the slide here. Our study participants, the grant for funding me, and then my team. I'm going to step out of the way so you can see Mirte as well. Thank you so much for inviting me to give this talk. And yeah, I'm excited about the panel discussion. Bye.